Thanks everyone for being here, and everyone in the live stream for sort of half being here, not geographically. So first, I'm going to introduce our panel. Please hold your applause till I finish that, and then we'll and then you applaud, and then we'll start getting into it. So first, to my immediate left is Sharon Zukin. She's a late adopter sociologist who writes about cities and hackathons and race and gentrification in Yelp reviews. She's known for teaching at the Brooklyn College and CUNY Graduate Center, and is the author of Naked City, The Death and Life of Authentic Urban Places, and Loft Living. Next, we have Ava Kaufman, who is a Brooklyn-based writer and the editor of The New Inquiry. And finally, we have Kyle Chayka, who's a writer living in Brooklyn, covering technology and aesthetics for publications, including The Verge, New York Times Magazine, and N+1. And we also had Kate Loss here, who unfortunately got stuck in weather and is delayed on an airplane, but we're going to have some quotes from her I'm going to throw in. So she's here in spirit. So give a round of applause for our panel. So one thing, let's just start sort of big picture here, right? And Kate, she had this great quote in something she recently wrote on her website where she poses the question, what do you recycle when it feels like the end of history? And I think the other three keynote panels are going to sketch out what the end of history is starting to look like. But that term end of history started much earlier in the 90s with like Francis Fukuyama and the idea of like, we just toy around with liberal democracy and everything else will be fine. And this seems like an interesting or a weird question to approach like design and urbanism and stuff like that. But I think there is definitely a lot that filters into our everyday lives through urbanism and through technology. So I was wondering if we could just pose to the panel what does that sort of end of history look like, and what are like the really big changes in the city happening right now in urbanism that we should be looking at?
Okay, since I'm sitting, am I on? Okay, so since I'm sitting next to you, I'll start us off. People were talking about the end of cities in the United States in the 1960s. When middle-class people, a lot of white people, a lot of capital investment moved out into the suburbs and eventually, as we know, into other regions of the world. But the cities did not end then. And then some cities began a slow and lingering, gasping agony, but others came out of it, like New York and Los Angeles and Boston. So the end of history has been applied to cities, but it's a selective kind of application. Nonetheless, cities are in a real crisis today in the United States and around the world. Now I'll talk about something for a second that I don't know anything about myself, and that is the environmental crisis. I mean, here we are 5 years after Hurricane Sandy in New York City, and there's still a whole lot of building on the waterfront, usually very expensive building on the waterfront, as well as media district and various digital creative districts in Brooklyn. And nobody's seriously trying to plan or build for the resiliency that they're talking about. So environmental disaster, that's the end of history as I see immediately applied to cities. And most cities of the world are built on rivers for reasons of transportation and steam power in previous centuries. So maybe we don't need to be right here, but we are here, and we have a lot of valuable land right here and a lot of people. So what are we going to do? The second kind of problem, of course, is an economic problem. There is such a mismatch between housing and income. If the end of history means the end of work as we have known it, and I suspect I might be the only person on this panel who has a full-time job, which does not reflect the qualities of my fellow panelists, but it might reflect my generation and my entry point into the labor force, and the fact that I'm a public employee. People can't afford to live in cities all around the world. That's that's an end of the city population. If they don't have any jobs to do in cities, that's another end of history as we have known it. Now it's your turn.
And I'll just say to the panel, we're opening up with this big question, then we'll get to, you have some prepared stuff, and we'll get to that in a second.
Going in order? Okay. Yeah, I think, I don't know about the end of history, or if I can speak to that specifically. But thinking about the kind of the biggest transformations in the city right now, I think all of us have written a little bit about how cities are being homogenized or turned into kind of anywheres or everywheres. But I think one aspect that's been kind of missing from that, or a lot of reporting has happened alongside that, is this idea that cities are also de-anonymizing us through the encroachment of surveillance technologies that are, at the same time as these apps are kind of breaking off smaller and smaller slices of our life and transforming them into capital and things that we do work for. These surveillance technologies are also doing the same and making it increasingly hard for anyone to have anywhere to hide. So I think that at the same time that these cities are becoming placeless, they're also becoming spaces where there's nowhere to hide. And I think thinking about those things alongside each other is really interesting, and not something I've seen at least a lot of media criticism or design writing about specifically.
Yeah, it's working. So I guess a lot of my recent work is focused on kind of superficial visual culture and aesthetics. But when I hear the phrase "the end of history" or think about that, I kind of think about how a lot of our aesthetic trends are moving toward this kind of idealized empty box of light and space, kind of part art gallery, part luxury condo. And that, to me, is like the visual culture and the form and the aesthetic that's also taking over cities, as you see, an old warehouse or a new skinny skyscraper transformed into just a bunch of empty boxes that people don't even often live in at this point. They just kind of exist as investment vehicles. And I think that's producing a kind of vapid, empty culture as well, as the city fabric and the city culture turns into just capital, I guess.
So while we're down on that side, Kyle, do you want to start with your presentation? Sure. We can work our way back.
So just open up the...
Yeah, just open up.
Yeah. All right, there we go. Is that what...
Or the green dot.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry, this is kind of grainy. Yeah, so I'm a journalist, and I say that as kind of an excuse. That is to say, a lot of my pieces kind of get at trends in a more superficial way than critical theory. But over the past year, I'm just kind of going to talk through what my work has been like over the past year. And it first kind of evolved when I started noticing this magazine everywhere I went on Earth. You would walk into a design boutique in Brooklyn, or an Airbnb in Copenhagen, or a bookstore in Beijing, and on every shelf there would be an issue of Kinfolk magazine. And it just became this kind of symbol that I kept running into and didn't understand. I didn't know how it got there. I didn't know why people really liked it. It's not a good magazine. It's not enjoyable to read. And yet you see this staring out at you everywhere, and it was deeply unsettling. And so I undertook to write this article that got at the founder of Kinfolk magazine, who is this guy, Nathan Williams. And this is in Kinfolk's offices in Copenhagen, a newly renovated space that is completely empty. And Nathan Williams, man of mystery, is a Mormon from rural Canada who has become this kind of like crypto lifestyle icon, even though no one knows who he is. He's not famous at all. He hates Instagram. And yet, like, his life and his work has given rise to this like kinfolk aesthetic that seems to be everywhere that the magazine is. Like, you don't just see the magazine, you see like a raw wood table and like some ceramic stuff and like, you know, other fancy magazines that have followed in kinfolk's wake. And so I went to go find him and meet him in Copenhagen just to see like how did this happen? And what I found was that he was super oblivious. Like, he is not on Instagram. He's not really big into social media. He has just like refined this kind of idealized 21st century lifestyle that everyone seems to identify with. And then, so after Kinfolk, you know, that piece came out, and I think what's interesting about Kinfolk too is that like the Kinfolk has 80,000 subscribers or something, but the hashtag Kinfolk on Instagram has millions and millions of posts, and it's all people posting images of Kinfolk on raw wood tables or like marble countertops as the symbol of their aspirational lifestyle, like next to their cortados. And so I did the Kinfolk piece, and then I started thinking about coffee shops and how every coffee shop in the world looks like this coffee shop, which is in Williamsburg. And you have the same combination of like blank white walls, exposed brick, wooden table, like minimalist iron furniture, small succulents on the tabletop, you know, the big wide windows that let in lots of natural light. And, you know, as I was thinking about these coffee shops, this is another coffee shop in Copenhagen, not far from the Kinfolk office. And what was funny, this is called Atelier September. And if you ask like your hipster friends what you should do in Copenhagen, they will tell you to go to Atelier September and have the avocado toast. So, you know, it's like there's this collection of lifestyle symbols that exist in the world that everyone has kind of gathered around. And then I started thinking about Airbnb. And this image is from this artist named Laurel Schwolst's project, Modern Life Space. And she would just crawl through Airbnb and like collect images of apartments from different places. And they all kind of look the same. Like there's this vocabulary, an Airbnb vocabulary of like minimalist furniture and big windows and white. And so as I was kind of like thinking about Airbnb, I kind of came up with this theory that this combination of stuff like Instagram and Airbnb and like, you know, other digital platforms and physical spaces like WeWork and other things, we're creating this kind of like generic geography across the world that has this kind of aesthetic. And anywhere you run into a Kinfolk magazine or like this particular combination of symbols, you're within this world that I called airspace. And it's kind of like identityless and frictionless if you're, you know, if you fit its requirements. And this is a WeWork office. And I was just struck by how this aesthetic has kind of spread everywhere, and yet it doesn't have a like geographic identity in any one place. So you could be in this space and be anywhere. You could be in Bangkok, you could be in New York, you could be in LA, you could be in, you know, wherever. This is the Airbnb office in San Francisco. And I interviewed Airbnb's like chief architect for this story about airspace and like the generic Airbnb aesthetic. And as I was talking to him, he made up this term that was international Airbnb style, entirely unprompted from me, which I loved because it's like partly it's like international style, the like modernist architectural movement, but also like it's an ideology that Airbnb has at the deepest parts of its like corporate DNA. So they have this office which was designed by Gensler, I want to say. But if you look at like in the back of this photo, there are all these little conference rooms, and each of the conference rooms is designed to look like a specific Airbnb from a different country. And so they've like appropriated the aesthetics of these different places and then mushed them all into their corporate headquarters, like in a metaphorical way, like making all of these places into one place and building a network between them, which is what I think they've done in a very powerful way. But you can see also the same aesthetic invades their space. Like there might as well be a Kinfolk magazine on the coffee table there. And then just like as I go forward with this work, I think more about the idea of lifestyle and like what lifestyle symbols you aspire to. And Airbnb has continued along this vein of like telling you that you can live anywhere and belong anywhere just by like staying in someone's house. So this ad is what, like, you become a graphic designer in Tokyo by staying in this artist loft. Like, by inhabiting this space, you suddenly become this super hip dude in like selvage denim and a blue shirt, you know, doodling your indie comics or whatever. And it like inspires within me this like deep sense of dread or doom that like, you know, everything I aspire to, everything I think is cool or interesting or compelling within my life is just like possibly a product of these platforms that exist in the world now that I travel through. And like, I look at this and I totally want to be there, you know. I wouldn't say no. So that's kind of the route that my work has taken, this like generic frictionless, identityless place that looks like a minimalist condo mixed with a coffee shop. And we all live there. That's it.
Thanks, Ed. And while Ava gets set up real fast, I'll just I want to put a pin in the idea of an art gallery and luxury condo, because those two things together, I think, are probably something we're gonna come back to pretty often.
If I can add something to that in the interlude, maybe Kyle's really terrific thought process brings up the end of geography, not the end of history. I mean, in addition to the end of history, the end of geography. But if you physically were in Copenhagen to do the interview and you weren't doing it on Skype or something like that, then we're talking about the counterpart to these digital agents of homogenization. We're talking about globally mobile consumers and producers of these things. So I think we have to bring together in one framework the globally mobile people as well as the global agents, cultural agents.
Yeah. I mean, can I say something quick? Yeah, I mean, part of my working process with that is like there is this hypermobile group of creative people who inhabit these spaces, and as you know, you work on your designs on your laptop in the coffee shop or whatever, or you go to Tokyo for a gig and you're staying in someone else's Airbnb. Like as this kind of homogenous community circulates through different places, I think they wear down the identity of those places, and as they want to consume the same things in every place, no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really helpful segue, because I wanted to talk a little bit about how this generic geography, how we're working for it, and who it's actually doing work for, and the kind of labor questions there. And my slides are a little more Google Images than Kinfolk, so there might be an eyesore. But I guess I first started thinking about kind of the smart city and also this idea of the smart home through thinking about the blockbuster game SimCity. And SimCity was, a lot of urban designers and planners and engineers have actually explicitly said that SimCity was the inspiration for what made them want to be an architect or an engineer. And when I was first looking at that and when I first heard that, I kind of imagined the smart city, in retrospect, kind of naively, as this city that we would build from scratch. Like we would build it from the ground up, and it would have all of these new sensors and tools and technologies, and just like in the game SimCity, it would maximize efficiency, and that would be the goal. And obviously the dystopic version of that is that you maximize efficiency, and that's at the cost of social repression. Maybe the trains run faster, but there's other human freedoms that are at stake. But I think what's actually emerged in the smart city is something that's a lot more pernicious and insidious, and not explicitly repressive, but actually fairly coercive. And I think that the smart city is already here, and it's in something like Uber, which I think more than any city is actually where we see SimCity's legacy. Uber's been really inspired by SimCity so much that it's using psychological tricks to gamify its rides and inspire its drivers and get us on their grid. I mean, we're signing up to be part of this smart city. And so I think part of the reason we don't realize it's already here is because it's not built from scratch, it's being retrofitted to fit our existing environments. And one of the terms that people have kind of used to explain this process is this idea of the Internet of Things. And it's kind of just a fancy way of saying that our smartphones and the thermostats we have in our houses, and ideally our toothbrushes and our beds and our fridges are all going to be hooked up to the internet. And they're going to scrape all of this data from our lives that to us is maybe individually really meaningless. I mean, who cares how many times I open the fridge or how long I brush my teeth for? But as an entire demographic, when a company takes all of this data, it's actually incredibly meaningful. And you can imagine a smart toothbrush that you get for free, and it's really cool because it counts how long you brush your teeth. But if you skip a night, it sends that information to your insurer, and your premium's raised. And that's like, it sounds kind of, like an exaggeration, but we're already seeing Facebook data being scraped and sold to auto insurers, depending on how many exclamation points someone uses in a post. That means they're a riskier driver. So this idea, Rem Koolhaas, an architect who you probably know a little more about, his idea is that the smart home is going to betray you by taking all of this data and kind of feeding it back into you, into these companies. In a really dangerous way. And I think the parallel here that I like to think about is a lot of people used to say that kind of like Second Life was going to be like virtual reality. Like we're all going to log into this kind of top-down centralized system that someone's designed, and those avatars are really going to take over. And what actually happened is that it was Facebook. And I think we're seeing a similar thing with the smart city. It's actually the Internet of Things. It's not a government. And Singapore is an outlier. It's an exception to the rule. New York City is also already the smart city, and we're already all kind of working for it in different ways. And I think that the kind of craziest part about this, and I know we'll go a little more into co-living, but the thing that I just kind of wanted to touch on is it's easier for us to understand, okay, these apps are quantifying our data or, taking bits of information from us. But what co-living is doing, and co-living is just Silicon Valley's rebranding of the idea of living with roommates. So they're selling you the idea of living with roommates. And it's companies like WeWork, it's co-working companies. You can now live with your work friends. They're also not just selling you the idea of living with roommates, they're selling you back the idea of community. So something that you would have already done, live, make friends, make breakfast, have a potluck, have a boyfriend, go to yoga, that's something that they're actually charging more in the rent. It's a built-in community. You get to facilitate the convening of distinct people and their passions. And what's crazy about that is not just that they're selling that, but it's actually that if you're making friends in your co-living space, or if you're hosting a dinner, you're creating value for this company, because then you go on their Instagram and they're selling that back to you as part of their brand. So it's not just co-living and work and co-working are being blended together because both are the same 24/7. It's that all of these basic functions that we previously didn't even understand could be commodified are now becoming so. And this is great. This is a co-working basement in a co-living space. And this is an Internet of Things device in a co-living space. And yeah, so I guess just to close, I think that SimCity is really fascinating, not just because of the top-down vision, but because in 2013 they added people for the first time. And they actually, they've seen it all. They kind of predicted everything, because the people they added aren't characters. They're these nameless, faceless workers that are dispatched by an algorithm to go work in an industrialized zone in the game that needs more workers and that fits within their class bracket. So the whole city's class divided, so they can only work, certain people can work in the factory, other people can work as doctors, and the algorithm then decides where they go and sleep at night, and they can sleep in any home that has a slot for them or a space. So when you think about this, really is the future of the co-living, like co-working environment. And that's why I kind of have the Uber app in the corner. And then one other crazy detail about that is the manual calls the sim agents selfless little troopers, and it mentions that if their home gets destroyed, they want to maximize efficiency, so they'll just go to another home. And I guess maybe that's a better answer to the future of the city, but it looks like that.
Thank you, selfless trooper number 2. Yeah. While Sharon's getting set up, I think one thing that's worth paying attention to is how when you bring up ideas of like post-capitalism or something other than capitalism or economic arrangements, you get like the government's gonna steal your toothbrush, right? Or like if there's no property, then your toothbrush goes away. But here, neoliberalism wants to rent your toothbrush to you. And so so it's actually neoliberal capitalism's taking your toothbrush, not communism. And instead you just rent it out, and it raises your insurance premiums. Perfect.
Okay. I deeply appreciate Kyle's and Ava's work, and I'm so glad to be able to join you today. So I'm a sociologist, and these are the kinds of things that I've been writing about for a long time. A number of years ago, I wrote a book about New York City. David mentioned it, Loft Living. And I thought, well, this is just a light little book, and I'm never going to come back to this. And it turned out that set me on the evil path of reviewing every 10 years what was happening in New York City, starting in the really epochal change era of the 1970s, and just looking at what has been happening to make things both better and worse since then. And most of my stuff comes out to this conclusion. So much for objective sociology. And just to explain a little bit on a slightly different scale from Ava's or Kyle's, so I started looking at how the real estate market in living lofts began. And I didn't see this as a question of any particular neighborhood like Soho or Tribeca, or certainly not Williamsburg when I started doing this research. And I had to come to grips with what I called the artistic mode of production, and Richard Florida became much more famous and much richer, calling that the creative class. So, we had this situation where the whole manufacturing ecosystem of cities was destroyed beginning in the 1960s, initially by movement to low-wage areas in the metropolitan region, and then by low-wage areas in the United States, and then by low-wage areas overseas. And artists came in to take up the slack, probably because of the numerical increase in artists and college graduates with the expansion of public as well as private higher education in the 1960s. But these people didn't have that much money, and they were willing to live in the kinds of spaces that genuine low-income people with much less education were not willing to consider residences. That is these, old decrepit industrial lofts. So here we have the founders of the restaurant that became really famous as a hallmark of early Soho, a restaurant called Food, taking down the signs of the restaurant that they replaced. And I think it's particularly interesting that they replaced a Latino restaurant owned by Dolores, I think it says, so that we never think that artists displaced people, but in fact they were part of the shock troops of gentrification, as some other people have called them, who displaced the manufacturers and their workers who were there before them. And of course we know what has happened to Soho since then. Food no longer exists, and some of the initial luxury goods stores of the 1990s no longer exist in Soho. But this is the kind of thing that I've been obsessed by and documenting since the 1980s. So most recently, as David mentioned, I wrote a book called Naked City, and I've been concerned with what vernacular landscapes have replaced the old vernacular landscapes and the people in the old vernacular landscapes. I mean, in the same neighborhood, this happens to be Crown Heights, not represented in the book, but these are more recent photographs. We have the vernacular landscape of the food hall, descended from Chelsea Market of the 1990s, and now reproduced in many similar real estate developments around this city and other cities. But they're replacing and displacing the low-priced shops where longtime residents have consumed their foods. And I think it's interesting that as you look at the march of real estate development, aka gentrification, you see the disappearance of the "we accept EBT" signs that you still see on this fish store in Crown Heights. So my most recent book, written with about 12 research partners in New York and 5 other global cities around the world, is about local shopping streets and how they embody globalization and cultural changes. So here's a street in a working class area, or former working class, now gentrifying area of East Amsterdam, where you have side by side 2 hair salons. The one on the left is the hair salon owned by and for mostly Muslim migrants, and that uses the traditional Dutch word for hair salon. But right next to it, we see the hairstylists using a different language, a different aesthetic, thanks Kyle, and catering to a different group in the population, college graduates and creatives who have not only been moving into that area because of market forces, but they've been actively recruited by the city government, which has labeled this immigrant area a problematic district and has made certain rules and regulations that have displaced a lot of the immigrant store owners and rental tenants. So that leads me to the same kind of point that Kyle and Ava get to. These are 2 other cities where my research partners and I have done research. Are we making all cities the same? Is it real estate development? Is it globally mobile consumers? Is it the digital platforms that convey the aesthetic? And what can we do about it? So that's the kind of stuff that I write about.
Thank you. So one thing that I think we could probably all start focusing in on as a group is trying to be is that cooperating? Just quit. Command F. Yeah. 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 There you go. Can we like zero in on what the capital flows are that are sort of pushing this homogenization, right? So we have sort of corporate co-living roommates, right? And but we also have these more international trends of trying to both be sort of like be familiar while also being a little bit of its place, right? Is this explicitly corporate, or could this be some other? Did it have to be corporate? Is basically what I'm asking for these sorts of homogenizing trends.
So you want us to zero in on capital flows, and you're posing a question of scale and scope. Is it corporate or is it individual?
Yeah.
And is it big or small?
Yeah. Well, because it's not only not all these processes aren't only nesting, but they also feed into each other in these really intricate ways, right? So what we just gotta like figure out where those are going, how it's flowing, what.
Okay, let me try to start us off. So when people talk about gentrification, they talk about state-led or market-led gentrification. And often there's a combination of state and market because governments, not least city governments, have a whole global toolkit of practices and strategies that they learn from their own meetings around the world, where they talk about how to attract more investors and more visitors, more tourists to their city. So there are those policy changes in addition to capital seeking a happy home for itself, and individuals, rich individuals, let's say, who are buying residences all over the world, forcing the merely rich local people to scale down their aspirations and look at other neighborhoods for their palatial homes, which forces the mere middle class to look in other neighborhoods, and then that leaves the rest of us scurrying around trying to find niches in the housing market. So there's a multi-dimensional set of actors and motivations that is or are pushing capital all over into whatever cities seem to provide safe havens, and but this is felt in different ways, again depending on local laws that may protect, or in New York City's case, not protect rental tenants.
Yeah, on the kind of the top-down smart city side that I said was an outlier. There are these huge initiatives to make economic free trade zones in places where there was maybe nothing, or like reclaim land from the sea and build a city that's by an airport in order to have some sort of economic hub or zone. So one interesting example is in South Korea. There's a city called Songdo that was kind of built from the ground up, and it's built on a protocol that it wants to export to other cities that they can also download. So it's this kind of like city operating system. And those are obviously major capital investments that are being funded by a combination of governments and private investors. But I think that on the co-living side, what's really interesting is that the co-working and co-living companies, they themselves are trying to model these patterns of flexibility. So WeWork doesn't even own its buildings, it leases them because it's trying to have an asset-light approach, is what it calls them. So, and I think that co-living, you can look at it in some ways as a solution to a problem that Silicon Valley created, like in cities, not in Silicon Valley only, but everywhere, which is to say that like, these are living situations in which they don't want you to sign a lease. They don't want you to settle down. It's housing not just for like the tech class, but for not for precarious workers, because the housing is still somewhat expensive, but they're trying to get into a price point where it actually is housing for someone who moves to a city with no contacts and who can live anywhere and work anywhere and just have their card, and maybe they swipe in at, Common and Crown Heights one night, and the other night maybe they're uptown working a different temporary gig and they swipe in there. And so it's not quite housing for Uber drivers, but it is housing for the kind of freelance economy.
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel there with like the new towns that were popular in like or they were trying to build them in decades past, where if you think that the city is blighted and impossible to save, you build these new sort of suburban towns on the fringes. These were popular around London, right? And those were a specific kind of connection to capital, because they were built for cars, and they had the form of them were meant to connect to very specific. You weren't taking that your car from the new town to a factory, right? You were taking it to some sort of bureaucratic paper pushing job. So I think it's fascinating that now there's like sort of this new shift where you create life as a service, basically, and that frees you up, and sort of like we'll get real Marxist here, right? It gives you that double freedom, right, of not only place but also culture. So because you can buy the culture too, right? So you can do both. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe speaking to a slightly more individual consumer level, I feel like a lot of this stuff speaks to how we consume brands rather than products. Like, the companies encourage us to identify more with WeWork or more with Airbnb or more with Common, which is another co-living space, than identify with like a neighborhood or something else. So we're kind of consuming these branded spaces and infrastructure rather than like building our own organic ones. And I think there's like, similarly to like how cities have become desirable, like the brand of a city is desirable, and then the brand of WeWork is desirable to certain people, and the brand of Airbnb style mobility is desirable to certain people. So I think even just participation in these systems has become aspirational to people, and that's part of the reason why individuals choose to consume what they offer.
But this to go back to David's question, this is so recent. I mean, it's within my lifetime anyway, maybe not in everybody's lifetime. Here in the 1980s, brands which had existed since the 1880s in the United States in the form of Gold Medal flour and Smith Brothers cough drops. They don't exist anymore, but they had a package with the two bearded Smith brothers on it, and they represented a late 19th century brand. Brands existed, but in the 1980s there was a concerted push to organize the whole production chain from manufacturing down through retail sales around the image of brands. And it kind of started with the Gap in a counterculture way in the 1960s, but the 1980s expanded that kind of whole brand selling to the Disney company. And then eventually we had a whole universe of branded stores, and generations, like a couple of generations of consumers that no longer knew you did not have to consume by brands. So this is, branding has been so inculcated into the human consciousness that we can't even conceive of a world where where there aren't brands, but there are companies. And I wonder, can we go back, or can we move to some other knowledge that demolishes the power of these companies?
Yeah, and I think sorry, I totally blanked out.
Branding.
I hope that, I mean, just as the like corporate digital platforms exist already and we kind of live through those, that possibly by organizing ourselves independently on more open source or more decentralized digital platforms, we can then use the same tools to create a more authentic, lifestyle that maybe it does not exist under a brand's logo.
I wanted to pose. Let's see if anyone buys this. Let's say that we could call safely call Soho a brand, right, or Dumbo, like neighborhoods as a brand, and they have a very specific aesthetic attached to them that's sort of like the Airbnb, like, because I live here, I now invoke and are this quirky creative type, which is really all the way back to like the loft living was an ability to have like this posh apartment that you could also put art in, right? It had that sort of space. So it was a luxury condo. It was literally a luxury condo art gallery. And so I wonder if what I'm getting at here is like, are we seeing this is what I want to see if you buy or not, if that place-based branding is getting finer, and so now you can have that brand in it goes all the way down to a room or even a table.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in like this, but you see what Kyle described at Airbnb with those city-themed rooms in a lot of tech spaces where they have the glass-walled conference rooms that are named for famous scientists, and I've seen that around the world too, or conference rooms that are named for neighborhoods of New York City, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there are conscious branding strategies that people use, companies use. I don't think neighborhoods have the organization to use those strategies, but some people are branding neighborhoods and making a profit from that. So this is this is all around us. In a way, people are grasping the local, and others are trying to make a profit from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is very obvious, but just people, taking pictures of Dumbo, parts of Dumbo on social media and posting them, they're doing the work of the branding for the space. And someone just had to come up with like a name like Dumbo, and then, which I don't.
Well, the naming. I'm sorry. The naming process is funny. Like, nobody really remembers, and nobody knows exactly who came up with Soho, for example.
Right.
And Dumbo, I'm not sure. I think I've read that artists who were already living in or near Dumbo before there was a Dumbo came up with the name because they thought it was such an awkward name it would never fly. But it took
Like Dumbo.
Right. It took 20. Yeah, right. Thanks. Thank you for voicing my unconscious.
I'm sorry.
It took 20 years for the space that Two Trees Management Company owns in Dumbo to become really marketable. It wasn't automatic, and it wasn't the name that propelled Dumbo to be so marketable. The same thing with Soho. It took maybe 20 years for these few artists' collectives or individual artist lofts to become the entity that was marketed as Soho. So it takes a long time. That area that we now know as Dumbo was formerly known as Fulton Ferry from the time Robert Fulton, or Fulton Street. Sorry, not Robert Fulton and a steamboat, but from the time there was a ferry in the late 19th century carrying residents of Brooklyn Heights to offices in Wall Street. So, neighborhood names all either commemorate some historic figure or some imagined historic figure, and they're often used to market the land or the buildings.
I feel like the brands of neighborhoods now are also getting appropriated and used to brand places that are not that neighborhood. Like, there's this great story on the Morning News, I think, and it's a list of every neighborhood of every major city that is the Brooklyn of that city. And so you have this like exportable brand of Brooklyn that can then be applied to different places and used to kind of identify and define and like delineate what they are and what they should be. And, you know, once you brand a neighborhood as the Brooklyn of, you know, Seoul or something, then that branding is going to draw more of the same Brooklyn people to that place. Like another example that comes to mind with that is Soho House, which is like uses a neighborhood name in London to then brand like a post-national series of like co-working, co-living luxury club spaces in Istanbul and New York and Shanghai and everywhere. And Soho House kind of appropriates this like upscale London identity from where it started and then just applies it wherever it goes. And I think that its connection with London itself becomes more and more tenuous, just like the idea of Brooklyn has less and less of a connection to literally being in Brooklyn.
People do that in business too. When startup founders pitch an idea, they say it's the Uber of X, right? That's been ridiculed already. So it's not just neighborhoods. I mean, we're particularly sensitive because we live here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the way you put it, saying it's even finer, the process of branding. And it seems like, I mean, I guess there's the lifestyle element of it, but thinking about the way in which these brands are entering our home or private spaces, it seems like there's a lot of questions there about the way in which these private spaces that are increasingly less private because maybe we're not even renting them, or maybe we're on like a 4-day lease, or maybe it's someone else's home being rented to someone else, being rented to us, but that they're also being made less private through all of these technologies and the Internet of Things and all of these brands in our home that are kind of blurring boundaries that we once thought are there. Because if our home is kind of hooked up or on the grid, it's now a data point among all of these other homes. And it's being circulated and used and entered into this flow in ways that we can anticipate some, and we won't even be able to anticipate others. And I guess the other point about branding that I think is interesting is you've written about some of this, but the way that local governments and, you know, what we conceive of as, you know, municipalities or not corporations are branding themselves more and more like companies. And we're seeing that with police departments as well, getting on social media and trying to have a voice. And it's kind of legible when we think about, you know, who these lifestyle brands are addressing. You know, they're addressing consumers. We can kind of grasp that. But I'm really curious, like, what's going on when a police department is being, you know, friendly on Twitter, or like who that address is for, or how that's working, or how becoming a brand is useful there.
Yeah, because you can say you can then decide who is the consumer of that brand by saying who you're talking to, and by that way you're saying like who belongs here, right? Is it if the police is wielding the brand of your city in a way that only speaks to a specific subset of people, white people, then like, you know, then all of a sudden you very quickly have said who belongs here and who's not. I would also point out that slightly different is probably the finest grain of how you can consume a place is when like Brooklyn becomes a flavor, right? I can go to a grocery. I live in upstate New York. I can go to a grocery store and get at least 5 things that have Brooklyn written on them, right? There's like pickles. I think there's like a mayonnaise, and like, you know, there's like a couple different things that I can literally consume, right? Obliterate it and make it a literal part of myself. And I think that's probably like maybe the end point there is that you can take these things that are ostensibly like not about a place, unless it, you know, maybe like the food is grown there or something like that, or like, you know, Philly cheesesteaks or something like that, right? But you can as the social scientist Jeff Goldblum said, you know, put it on Lunchbox and you're selling it and you're selling it, right? You can throw it anywhere. Yeah. I think one thing I want to make sure we get to before we get to audience questions is now going back to, well, how, not necessarily what do we do about this, but what are some some things that can be brought to bear that mitigate some of the worst effects of this, right? So whether that's, so if we're privatizing culture that can provide value in an economy like the one that we find ourselves in, what are the ways of taking stuff either out of private corporate hands and put it in private, like smaller groups of people, or socializing the value of all of these sorts of things?
Well, I think your work can speak to this more, but I mean, I think one thing we can do is anytime we're talking about something like co-living, point to the forms of co-living that already exist. So we already have cooperative housing units in New York, and when we're writing articles about these things that are new, like going out of our way to point out in which they're just dressing up old forms of things and jacking up the prices. And we've also had single resident occupancy units in New York, which have had a kind of checkered history, but could be reclaimed as a form where singles need to live. Because co-living proponents and boosters aren't wrong in saying that there is a huge problem. Singles don't have places. Singles, that's their word. But people living alone don't have places to live in New York, and that there's a huge demand. Like, they're right, but we can then do the work of pointing to other solutions and solutions that exist through zoning and through the city.
I think that Ava has written about and spoken about something very important, co-living arrangements. There are co-living forms in Sweden, for example, and in parts of the United States, where people share the kitchens, they share responsibilities for cooking, they have living units of various sizes, or apartments of various sizes, in one building together with other people. And they are a social community without all the garbage PR about community. But the basic point of those arrangements is that they're not made for profit. Housing is not an expensive commodity under those arrangements. And I think that's important to keep reminding people that co-living is not just this glorified college dorm for post-college people, but it can be a pretty radical form of life. And there are co-op, as you said, there are historic co-op apartment complex in New York City, but a lot of them have got to the end of their legal term, and they're being sold off as individual apartments usually at market prices. So, how do we attack that kind of commodification and keep reminding people that co-living used to mean not paying an arm and a leg for housing?
Yeah, I guess I want to get at the question in a slightly different way, where it's like, I don't know if it's actually different, but I think we can also think more about what looks fashionable or cool to us. Like, I think there's a sexiness to co-living and co-working that like masks the actual realities of these things and the possibilities of us organizing those same things on our own in like an uncapitalized way. And then I think on an aesthetic level, like with the kind of stuff that I talked about, maybe we can just be more aware of what shapes the spaces and things that we think are cool or compelling to consume. Like, after having thought about this stuff for what's probably a silly amount of time, when I go to a coffee shop that looks like the ones that were up there, or when I, think about how I want to Instagram my cortado or something, I think again. It kind of has introduced a skepticism to my appreciation of those things, and a much more thought about how I can create things that people want to consume that have a more tangible relationship to our communities or our identities that aren't just imposed on us from lifestyle magazines or Instagram or Airbnb, these like corporatized, capitalized networks.
Yeah, no, I would also throw in as moderator prerogative, like actually existing forms of cooperative housing, like Co-op City, right, in the Bronx, is also one of the largest centers of equity owned by people of color, like that, and that's probably not a coincidence, right? So like I think that's a and they're also fairly they're aging out of it, right? So like there's a distinct possibility that could be privatized fairly quickly if enough people like left it, right? And then there's also, of course, like land banks, stuff that you've all talked about, that are like really easy plug and play, sort of like not rocket surgery sort of opportunities to like figure out what. Yeah, I said rocket surgery. What to things that aren't hard, that have proved that they work and circulate wealth fairly well, right? So I think we're about there where we can take some questions, unless anyone wants to add in anything there. No? Okay, and this is the time where I play daytime talk show host and go into the audience with my microphone. All right, yeah, I guess I'll you first.
Thank you. First off, thank you for your presentation. My name is Mariella. I wanted to just make a quick comment and then a question. My quick comment is that I'm an immigrant, and the reason why I mention that is because my experience in moving around to a lot of cities and living in a variety of different places, learning new languages, all that kind of stuff has been relatively traumatizing, I would say. And in moving to new places and in finding familiarity with new places, I want to ask what parts of our life and what parts of our uniqueness you think we can look forward to maybe not throwing into a melting pot where things are going to continue to look the same everywhere in the world. If other immigrants are going to experience this, if future generations are going to experience this, what parts of our uniqueness in our life, in where we live, the architecture, the food that we consume, the art that we look at, the music that we listen to, what parts of our life can we hope that will not look like that?
I guess I can
If any.
start. Yeah. I mean, I worry about that issue of like everything looking the same and us losing so many things that we identify with, like our homes or our aesthetics or our food or whatever. But I think if that condition is permanent or if it develops more going forward, then what comes to mind is like the actual networks of people that we move through and the ones that we create for ourselves. So those might not be based on a single place or a single, environment or object of consumption, but there's still these like relationships that you have with specific people, and it might be a nice thing that they transcend space and physical proximity.
Well, I worry about this too. I think that migration is such a strong experience today that a melding of cultures, more fusions are inevitable. If we try to oppose that, we wind up sounding like the Trump administration. And I just see more and more people borrowing the cultures of other people. Sometimes because they willingly want to profit from it, or sometimes because they appreciate other things. And the fluidity of people and the fluidity of ideas can be good. Protecting people's fluidity now, particularly if their legal status is not secure, is very important. So I don't really know, and I don't know what, how to make a rule about what is the bad side of that and what is the good side.
Other questions?
No questions. This looks like one of my classes.
So a lot of the discussion tonight has been kind of focused on a top-down view. For example, with Uber or branding or homogenization. But I wonder if you could address this whole issue from a bottom-up. For example, Kyle mentioned about the kinfolk, that minimalist aesthetic. What about that being potentially a reaction to the materialism that's so prevalent in society, about people's concern about the environment, that we're using too much of the resources, so that being a reaction to that? And for example, for Ava, instead of the Uberization of city life, what about the communal living being a reaction to income inequality that's becoming a huge problem globally? People not having enough money or resources to have their own place. Or the idea that communal living reflects also the problem that is presented by the web or the internet of people becoming more and more isolated in their lives and not interacting and wanting to try to somehow escape that.
Yeah, I guess I'll go quick. Yeah, I think the minimalism aesthetic thing is one phenomenon, and I do think that's a reaction to the excess of like stuff in our lives and the amount of visual and linguistic information that's coming at us at all times. But I think I want to separate like the minimalist aesthetic from the structures that spread the aesthetic. I think one way that I've thought about it in my work is that like there isn't a Starbucks like corporation telling all of these coffee shops that they have to decorate the same way. There's no like mandated thing. But from the bottom up, like if consumers have a taste for that kind of aesthetic and they're moving between cities all the time and recommending coffee shops that look like that on Yelp or Foursquare, then like that aesthetic is gradually going to become like the marketable aesthetic that will draw more people to your business. And that's kind of like a bottom-up reason that an aesthetic like that might evolve with the help of Yelp and Foursquare and Instagram.
Hey, thanks for your question. I think you're absolutely right to say that, communal living is arising from economic inequality and, from society fracturing and from people also wanting to live together and from apartments for a lot of people, apartments that, house a lot of people being widely available. But I feel like it's important to separate communal living, which I'm sure many of us already do, living with roommates, from co-living, which I feel like is the explicit effort of these companies to brand it and hype it and make it into something new. Which is not to say that their efforts at co-living have to be negative in all their forms, or because it's tech it's bad. I'm just, I think, more interested in asking kind of why are they doing this and what are they getting out of it? And one thing they seem to be getting out of it is making money off of the activities that we would already do with our roommates in close quarters. And also right now, making money by charging more and by having flexible leases in their buildings and by buying buildings that are sometimes, previously occupied by people already living in those neighborhoods and pushing them out with, flexible people who are moving in, who right now are a certain class and income bracket of people.
So let me try to add two different suggestions, the old suggestion and the new suggestion. The old suggestion is to work in local communities, to press local government to provide public services that local government is supposed to provide. And as long as they don't do that by using a public-private partnership, or maybe even if they do use a public-private partnership, life to some degree may be better for people who live in cities. The new suggestion is to keep innovating, to use whatever knowledge we have to create microgrids and more urban agriculture, or at least regional agriculture, more alternative markets. The problem is that good ideas often are seized by people, or groups, or businesses that take them farther and capitalize on them. Like, the flea market idea that was turned into smorgasbord and then exported to other places, at least in the United States. Sharing, sharing is a good idea. How can it be done in ways that bring people together and further their community, their solidarity, their autonomy, without getting appropriated?
Let's do another one. All right. Yeah.
I want to piggyback on something David said at the beginning, where he was talking about the end of history. From what I've heard, you're talking about the end of community and society. Kyle, you're talking about the end of community in terms of the kinfolk sort of replacing a community aesthetic with a generic society, where you're talking about the co-workership, the co-living spaces as an elimination of societal impact. So if this is the end of community and society, is the grid the beginning of community and society? And if it's not, what is it? I went with Tony's argument, obviously, but
like, how do we start? How do we move on?
What's the starting point? Yeah.
The restarting point, or I don't know. I mean, on a cultural level, to me, I'm not convinced that there is a way to get outside of the system that exists now. Like, if we have this massive grid, right, of Facebook and Instagram and whatever that spreads culture, like images and text and whatever, if that exists and it occupies the entire world, then like everyone is kind of going to be experiencing the same things. And even if something is cool or alternative or obscure, it's instantly going to be absorbed by the mainstream. And then it's all of a sudden the global mainstream generic. So I think culturally it's going to be difficult to both have a massive audience and exist outside of those networks.
It's become profitable even for individuals to take advantage of some of these digital platforms. Like, I trace a lot of what we've been talking about to eBay back, when in the 1990s, where people hived off parts of themselves, their possessions, and sold parts of themselves online. And then Airbnb comes along and people are hiving off parts of their living space and selling that. And people have a lot of people have, for reasons of necessity or other reasons, have become very adept at using digital platforms to commodify themselves. So, I think more at the danger of all of us on the stage sounding like Luddites and, horribly regressive, unimaginative souls. I think that more experimentation is necessary. More people have to get together and try something.
I feel like I'm actually not that pessimistic about the cultural side of things. Like, I feel like when we're talking about an everywhere or any place turning into anywhere, I think that's true for particular groups of people or particular desires that people have. But even when we're thinking about this idea of Brooklyn, it's important to ask, well, who's Brooklyn? I mean, Brooklyn is huge, and when we're talking about Brooklyn, we're still usually only talking about, 30 or 40% of the borough that looks a certain way, and obviously that's expanding. But I don't think that these digital maps are like completely taking over the territory in the sense of the Borgesian story that Airbnb is taking over parts of the world, but I don't think it's taking over all the world. I think where I get more worried, and I'll just touch on it briefly so that it's not a tangent, is on the kind of surveillance side of things and that grid and all of these technologies actually plugging us into a kind of bigger system in that sense, in which we kind of can maybe talk about everybody without overgeneralizing who that is.
Through strategies of rationalization, we're all getting swept up into that. I mean, I see that movement coming through big organizations even more than coming through the household products that you talked about. Although technically, yes, a lot of that comes through everyday objects. Even in the Obama administration, the digitalization of medical records was held out as a goal, making healthcare more efficient and making it cheaper. But the digitalization of medical records often brings with it a strong probability of surveillance, and you alluded to that before. So at transportation, you've written about this too. Smart cities and big data, in principle, make it possible to create more rational people-moving transportation systems. But then maybe that kind of technology will also be responsible for cutting services to less frequented networks, transportation networks. So it's not just surveillance, but it's and not only in our households, but through many different webs. Digital technology makes it possible to move from the incredible growth of security guards as an occupation to the incredible growth of CCTV.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of like the end of idea is that so many different things are just becoming data, and then the data is filtered by algorithms. Like with the surveillance technology that Ava has written about, I think you've covered face recognition stuff as well, right? Like, the CCTV camera captures your face, and your entire being is reduced to a series of data points and stored in a bank. Like, that is you. And that you is so much more easily filtered and manipulated than your actual physical body in space.
I love that you mentioned security guards, Sharon, because some surveillance critics I know have a kind of joke about the future of automation, and to them they say, the future of the city looks like an empty mall and a bunch of security guards guarding it. Like that's kind of going to be the last job. Hopeful question.
Yeah. Let's go up here for one more.
Right. So anecdotally, the naming of Soho was after an aristocratic British hunting cry, which they imported when they started hunting women in the Soho area of London, and then it got imported. Anecdotally, question-wise, when I walk into a queer flat in London, and not a rich queer flat, it has exactly the same aesthetic as walking into not a rich queer flat in New York, and I can only really compare these two. That's all I've been to recently. When I walk into a falafel stand or falafel shop in London, it's got the same branding, it's got the same aesthetics. These are network effects, not necessarily with people who travel a lot. Is there also like the same thing happening to people who aren't of this kind of world traveling creative class? And how has that happened? How does that play out?
Well, I want to say something now that may not answer your question, but it responds to something that was said earlier, and a lot of this conversation. It's not just magazines like Kinfolk, and it's not just digital platforms like Airbnb that are spreading this aesthetic. I mean, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it was IKEA. It was a not even mail order catalog IKEA. It was brick and mortar store IKEA. So maybe the technology changes, the means change, but there are always agents that are disseminating different cultural forms or new cultural forms. Now maybe it's, the scale is much greater, and it's easier to access these cultural forms as a template.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, there's a distinction between like buying a product from an IKEA, say like the same IKEA table is everywhere, and then assembling like a curated lifestyle assemblage that it like signifies something for you. So I think that is the shift that's happened. Like, it's not something you can just buy from one company yet. It's something that you kind of have to assemble and then identify with. But I think to the question, something that I wish I had talked about more when I introduced myself, I guess, is that I do think this effect is most prevalent within like a global mobile like creative class. And I think I think similar things will happen outside of it, but I think it's important to talk about how exclusive and isolating and dangerous the spread of an aesthetic like that can be. Like, I think after I published that piece on like the generic coffee shop, someone in South Africa said that whenever they walked into a coffee shop like that, like, you know, it felt like a symbol of violent gentrification and oppression. So I think there's like, they're very different. Like, the same thing can be seen from two very different angles.
So I think we're about out of time. I want to please give one more round of applause to our wonderful panel. And stick around, don't go anywhere. We're going to go right into our second keynote. Thank you.